A lot of it comes from a religious source. I mean, and a lot of it's really genuine. People do not want to accept the idea that what they interpret as meaning, everything is determined. It doesn't mean, science doesn't mean that, but if you have a superficial understanding of science, and in fact, even if you read what plenty of scientists and philosophers say, it's basically saying, look, you don't have any free will, you don't have any choices, everything's determined, you're just kind of acting out something in a system of controls that you have nothing to do with. Well, I don't want to believe that, in fact don't, and I can easily see why other people don't want to believe it. They want to believe that there's something good going on in the world. Maybe I can't grasp it, but there's a force somewhere that is trying to make us better, make the world better, make good things happen and bad things not happen. And also just for personal reasons. To go back to the mother of the dying child, I want to see my child again someday, so I'd like to believe it. One consequence of this array of beliefs is to think that the world was created. And that's very common. I mean, founding fathers, for example, who did want to separate church and state, were called deists. The idea was that God, it was even said this way, God is a retired engineer. He got the whole thing started, gave it a kick in the pants, and then he left, and you guys are supposed to run it. That was, kind of like sort of secular religion that was common at the time. But at the same time, the U.S. has, since its origins, has been kind of off the spectrum in extremist religious beliefs. I mean, if you do look at, there are comparative studies, and belief in the United States, belief in miracles, in the devil, the world was created 10,000 years ago, and so on, is just off the spectrum. You don't find that. To some extent, you find it in other industrial societies, like in England, you find it. But the United States is literally off the graph. And this goes back to its origins. I mean, the country was founded by religious extremists. The people who founded, the settlers of New England were following God's will. There's a streak in U.S. history which is called providentialism. Very dominant streak, goes all the way from, founding fathers, so-called, up to the current presidents and so on. God has a conception of history. We're acting it out. And some of the ways in which this was applied are pretty remarkable. So, for example, the core of, take, say, the English settlers in New England, Mayflower and all that stuff. The first charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, given by the King Charles, was, I think, 1628. And the goal of the Massachusetts colony was to bring the benefits of civilization, including the Christian religion, to the Indians who were pleading for it. We're doing them a favor. In fact, if you look at the Great Seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, around 1629, they had a seal. It's very revealing. It ought to be on the wall of every classroom in the country. What it shows, it's the founding of the country. What it shows is an Indian with spears pointed down, sign of peace. And out of the Indian's mouth is a scroll, and the scroll says, "Come over and help us." So the colonists were carrying out what is now called the responsibility to protect, fancy term for imperialism that's common. So they were carrying out the responsibility to protect. They were totally selfless. They were coming over just to answer the plea of the indigenous population to come over and help us. That's the time when the famous phrase, "city on a hill," was produced. 1630, John Winthrop gave a famous statement and said, "We're a city on the hill, we're not like any other country in the world, we're benevolent, selfless, coming over to answer the plea of the Indians to help us." That goes right until today. That's a leading theme of scholarship. that we're different, and journalism, of course, that we're just different from everyone else because we're a city on the hill, shining city on the hill, as Reagan put it. It's right to this minute. And the reason comes from our answering the plea of the natives to help them. Well, in fact, they exterminated them. And that was explained too. You take a look at leading Supreme Court justices, commentators, others. They say, well, the ways of God are mysterious. Although we came to help the Indians and we tried, everything we did was in their interest. Somehow they withered away, and that's the phrase that was used. They just kind of like the leaves in autumn. They kind of blew away. And this goes right on to the present. I mean, towards the end of the century, like say early 20th century, I mean, it was pretty hard to go on with this. So you get people like Theodore Roosevelt, one of the most extreme racist murderers in American history. That's why he's on Mount Rushmore. He explained to, he was, during the second term of his presidency, it must have been maybe 1906 or 7, I don't know when exactly, he gave a talk to a group of missionaries in which he explained to them that it was for the benefit of the native population that we exterminated them. Literally, almost his words. He said because it enabled a superior race to replace them. And that was very common. I mean, you read things like that in Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great heroes. This is an extremely racist country. And they invented a mythology of Anglo-Saxonism. We're all Anglo-Saxons, like you and me. We're Anglo-Saxons. Jefferson, for example, who was a big believer in this, said we've got to go back to, the 8th century or something, when there were pure Anglo-Saxons, not before they were contaminated by others, and that's the ideal of humanity and justice and everything. This runs, Benjamin Franklin, for example,
so the Germans just got there first.
The Germans
just got there first as a
well,
massive...
Actually, Franklin thought that we shouldn't allow immigration of Germans and Swedes because they're not white enough. They're kind of a little off color. But we, the pure Anglo-Saxons, just carry civilization forward. I mean, it's incredible, the history of it. I won't go through it, but Hitler looks mild in comparison. And this goes right through in fact, Hitler kind of used this as a model. It goes right through American history, goes right until today. It's part of the American exceptionalism, Wilsonian idealism, very racist, and it's just all over. Okay, well, one aspect of these beliefs is just what most of the world would call religious extremism. So there were what were called great reawakenings in American history, periods of sort of mass enthusiasm, because Christ is coming or whatever it may be. And it's all over the place. It just keeps recurring. There's a big one in the 1950s, and you get it's changed in the last 30 years in an interesting way. This has been right through American history, but it never really entered the core of the political system. There were it influenced things, but there was a big change. I think it comes from Jimmy. I don't think it's ever been studied, but my impression is it comes from Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was an honest, sincere, fundamentalist Christian. Probably believed everything he was saying. Kind of like an honest, simple guy. And, so all this business, which most of the world considers kind of like off the wall, he believed. And I think and American elections are essentially run by the PR industry, and party managers got an idea, I think. I can't prove it, but it seems to me what happened is this. Party managers recognized that if you pretend to be, a devout Christian, you pick up like 30% of the vote. And in fact, every presidential candidate since Carter has professed to be a devout Christian. Take, say, Bill Clinton, probably is about as religious as I am. His handlers made sure that every Monday morning there was a photograph of him in the Baptist church or whatever it is, singing hymns and so on and so forth. I mean, that's a way in which you sort of pick up a segment of the population. And I don't think there's a single exception since Carter.
You lose integrity, honesty, and everything else goes down the drain, of course, as a habitual obstacle
but
to
it's
success.
It's appealing to something that's pretty deep in American culture, including, it's intertwined with racism, with Anglo-Saxon fanaticism, with come over and help us. You find it's just a big strain in the culture.